It started again last night. The knocking. 3 soft taps against the glass, patient, rhythmic, almost polite. I turned toward the window. The red digits on the bedside clock read 2:12 a.m. Exactly the same time as the last 2 nights. At first, I told myself it was the wind. Then, the neighbor's cat. But the third night, when I heard it again, slow, deliberate, I knew it was neither. Then came the voice. Small, raspy, a boy's whisper, thin as breath through a cracked reed. "Mama, I'm cold." The sound hit me like a nail through the chest. Every nerve in my body went still. That voice, that pitch, that lisp between the M and the A, I knew it. I had tuned that voice once, 43 years ago, inside a recording booth that no longer exists. I stumbled out of bed, heart hammering. The floorboards creaked like they were warning me to stop. But I had to look. I pulled the curtain aside. Outside, under the dim yellow of the street lamp, stood a boy no older than 6, barefoot. Pajamas clinging to his thin frame, his skin the color of fog. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stared up at me through the glass, wide-eyed and waiting. "Eli?" My throat burned when I said the name. The boy tilted his head, almost curious, like he'd heard it before but couldn't remember from where. A gust of wind tore through the yard. His hair lifted, light as ash. Then, silence. He turned and walked backward into the mist until he vanished. I stood there frozen, hand pressed against the cold glass. That's when I saw it. A small handprint smeared with mud on the outside of the window pane. Not old. Wet. Fresh. The air in the room was wrong. It carried the faint smell of burnt wood and singed wires, a smell I hadn't known since the night the fire took everything. The night the coroner told me we couldn't save the child. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to breathe, staring at that handprint until the sun started to rise behind it. My hands were trembling, my ears ringing with static. From the corner of the room, my old wooden Zenith radio, the one I swore I'd never touch again, crackled to life by itself. The dial wasn't even turned on. Out of the static came that same whisper again, soft and low. "Mama." The voice dissolved into static, then into silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to believe it was grief playing tricks, or the years of loneliness echoing back at me through metal and dust. But deep down, I knew. There are sounds the world forgets, and some that never die, no matter how long you try to bury them. I touched the glass again, tracing the outline of that tiny, muddy hand. "My son died 43 years ago," I whispered under my breath. And yet tonight, he found his way back to knock on my window. I used to believe sound could heal people. Back then, before the fire, that was my job. I was an audio engineer for St. T. Cecilia Cathedral, the grand old church on Decatur Street whose bells never missed a funeral. My duty was to make grief beautiful, to smooth every sob, to tune every hymn until it landed on the perfect pitch of comfort. Father Donnelly used to say, "Lorraine, no one should cry off key in God's house." I laughed the first time he said it. Later, it stopped being funny. That's where Eli grew up, behind the choir loft, surrounded by tangled cables and brass microphones taller than he was. He loved to hum along to the organ pipes. 6 years old, missing his front teeth, he'd climb on a wooden stool beside me and say, "Mama, when people die, do they still hear the music?" "Maybe," I'd tell him, "if it's in the right key." He'd giggle, tap the mic with a small finger, and make the speakers pop. His laughter echoed through the nave like tiny fireworks. I still hear it sometimes when the wind passes through hollow metal. Then came May 12, 1982, a Thursday. I remember because the bulletin board schedule read, "Funeral choir rehearsal, 7 p.m. The candle by the mixing desk must have tipped. Or maybe it was faulty wiring in the reverb unit. I never found out. All I know is that one moment I was splicing tape, and the next, the air turned orange. Smoke rolled through the rafters faster than breath. Someone screamed Eli's name. Maybe it was me. The rest blurs. Sirens, collapsing wood, the smell of burnt varnish and wet hymnals. When the firemen dragged me out, they said the boys' section had already fallen. They gave me a box the next morning. Not a coffin. Just a tin urn with his name printed wrong. Ely. I kept the ashes. And I kept the radio. It was a Zenith model H845, walnut finish, one knob missing. I'd bought it secondhand the year Eli was born. During the fire it had melted on one side, the plastic warped into a soft wave, yet somehow it still worked. When I turned it on afterward, it hissed and cracked like a chest trying to breathe. For months after his death, I'd sit in the dark, twisting the dial between stations just to fill the house with something other than silence. Sometimes, buried under the static, I'd hear what sounded like him. 2 syllables, broken but distinct. Mama. The first time it happened, I fell to my knees. The second time, I recorded it. I played that 10-second clip for Father Donnelly, for the police, for anyone who'd listen. They all told me the same thing. Interference. Feedback. Wishful thinking. So I stopped asking. But I never stopped listening. Every February 9th, Eli's birthday, I light a candle beside the radio and press play on that tape. The hiss begins, then the warped whisper follows, always the same, never more, never less. I whisper back, I'm still here. Then I turn it off before dawn. That was my ritual for 40 years. People move on. They remarry, repaint, relocate. I stayed. Same house, same curtains, same burn marks near the window frame. The neighborhood changed. The world learned to store memories in clouds. I still stored mine on cassette. Some nights, when thunder rattled the gutters, I'd imagine Eli crouched somewhere beyond the static, waiting for me to adjust the frequency just right. I'd rest my ear against the speaker and pretend I could feel his breath through it, faint and warm. The doctors call it auditory grief memory. They say the brain replays old frequencies when it's starving for the familiar. Maybe they're right. But grief has its own logic. It teaches you to mistake pain for presence. Last winter, when the power went out for 3 days, the house dropped into a darkness so thick it hummed. I lit the candle as usual, set the urn by the window, and sat with the radio. When the electricity flickered back, the radio sparked and emitted a sharp pop, like a heartbeat on a monitor. Then it fell silent. I thought that was the end of it. Until last week. That's when the knocking began. At first I ignored it. But on the third night, when I looked through the glass and saw that boy, the same height, same hesitant tilt of the head, I knew the past hadn't finished with me. I spent the following day trying to convince myself of reasonable things. That he was a lost child. That my mind had stitched Eli's features onto a stranger's face. That 43 years of isolation can blur any line between hearing and remembering. But later that evening, as dusk slid in through the blinds, I noticed something else. The radio, untouched since the outage, sat on the dresser. Its power cord wasn't even plugged in, yet the tuning dial glowed faintly amber, as if a pulse were beating behind it. When I leaned close, I heard a faint hum, the same low frequency that used to accompany Eli's voice tests. I pressed my fingers to the casing. It was warm. Too warm. I whispered into the mesh grill, half ashamed of myself, Eli, if you're there, give me a sign. The hum deepened, then a single burst of static, then silence. Maybe the living aren't supposed to answer back. Maybe that's the rule. But grief doesn't care about rules. It keeps knocking, waiting, testing the glass for cracks. That night I dreamed of the church again, the choir singing without sound, the pews filled with smoke instead of people. When I woke, the smell of burnt wood and candle wax still lingered, and a new handprint had appeared on the inside of the window, smaller than my palm. I wiped it once. The mark stayed. I used to make sure every funeral song hit the note of comfort. Now I'm beginning to wonder if I've tuned my life to the wrong key. Before the fire, my world was made of sound. And Eli was its brightest note. He was 5 when I first let him step inside my studio at St. D. Cecilia. The room smelled of coffee and dusted pine, the scent of old hymn sheets and lacquered pews. Rows of red cables snaked across the floor like arteries, leading to the heart of every microphone. He stood there in oversized headphones, the pad swallowing half his cheeks, eyes wide with that stunned joy children reserve for magic they don't yet understand. "Can I try, Mama? Only if you promise not to shout." "I don't shout," he said, then immediately shouted, "I don't shout." The laughter that burst from us both filled the booth, bouncing off the foam walls until it became music itself. I remember pressing the record button, just to keep that moment alive a little longer. "Say it again, Eli." "Mama." Louder. "Mama." The meter spiked. The red light blinked like a heartbeat. He covered his mouth, eyes round. "Oops." "Don't worry," I told him. "Every good song starts with someone being too loud." We played it back through the big speakers. His voice, thin, high, alive, floated around us, echoing off the copper pipes above. He clapped, hearing himself for the first time. That was the day I realized how much power a voice can hold. A sound that small could fill an entire room and make it feel holy. After that, he wanted to record everything. The rattle of coins in my purse, the rain tapping the roof, the whistle of the kettle. He'd say, "Let's keep it, Mama, before it goes away." So I taught him how to rewind, how to splice tape with a razor blade, how to mark silence with chalk. When money was tight, I took freelance work repairing broken radios for the fishermen along the bayou. Eli would sit beside me on the porch, counting screws, humming while I soldered. He learned to listen the way other children learned to read, by patience, not by sight. "Listen close," I'd tell him. "Every machine has a heartbeat. If you can find it, you can fix it." He'd press his ear against the casing and whisper, "I can hear it breathing." Evenings were the best. After supper, we'd lie on the floor with our heads near the speaker and tune between stations, chasing voices from distant towns. Somewhere between static and gospel, we'd always find one faint song that belonged to no frequency at all. Eli called it the ghost song. He said it lived in the space between stations, where nobody talks but somebody's listening. I laughed then. Now I'm not so sure he was wrong. One summer night, the church hosted a charity concert. Father Donnelly asked Eli to sing the opening verse. I remember sewing the buttons on his white shirt, my fingers trembling more than the needle. When he stepped on stage, he looked so small against the cathedral lights. He opened his mouth, and the note that came out was pure, clear, and painfully human. People said afterward that they'd never heard a child sing grief that beautifully. I only heard fear, the kind every mother hears beneath even the sweetest sound. The fear of losing what you love because it's too good for this world. After the performance, he ran into my arms, flushed with pride. Did I sound like the angels? Better, I said. You sounded real. He grinned. Then they'll remember me. He was 6 a few weeks later when the fire came. Sometimes I think back to that recording, the one where he shouted, "Mama," too loud. I kept the reel in a tin box for years, even after it warped. The tape smells faintly of smoke now. When I play it, the voice flickers in and out, half buried under static. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear him inhaling between the syllables, that tiny gasp before he lets the word go. Every mother knows that sound, the moment right before a child calls her name. It's not the word that matters. It's the breath before it. The proof of life. That's what I kept. That's what I lost. I used to believe I'd recorded enough of him to keep him forever. But recordings fade. Tape stretches. Now, when I rewind the reel, all I get is hiss and a whisper that could be air or memory. Still, I press play again and again. Because somewhere in that hiss, I keep hoping he's hiding, waiting for me to answer. For 3 weeks now, the nights have followed the same rhythm. At exactly 2012 a.m., when the house should be deepest in sleep, I hear them. Small footsteps moving down the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, careful. Too light to be an adult, too steady to be the pipes or the wind. The boards of this old house complain with every step, so I know the sound by heart. Creak, pause, creak, like someone tiptoeing toward a secret. The first night, I turned on the light and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the faint crackle of the radio downstairs, though I hadn't plugged it in for months. By the second week, the sound had become part of my body. I would wake seconds before it started, heart already racing ahead of the noise. I'd hold my breath, listening, waiting for the pattern to end. But it never did. It only wandered closer, stopping right outside my door before fading back into silence. I told myself it was the house settling, the winter wood expanding. I told myself many things. But the truth was simpler. Someone or something was walking in my hallway every night. One morning, I asked Mrs. Gable, my neighbor, about it. She's lived here even longer than I have, with a hearing aid that squeals whenever she leans too close. She lowered her voice like gossip was a form of prayer. "There's been a boy roaming around these blocks," she said. "About 6, maybe 7. People say his mama lost her mind last spring, left him on the street. The police came once, but he's quick disappears before they get here. A boy. 6 years old." The words pressed against me like fingers. Eli had been 6? When? I cut the thought off. Coincidence, I told myself. The city is full of lost children. But that night, I locked every window and left a bowl of milk by the door anyway, the way my grandmother used to when she thought spirits were restless. By morning, the milk was gone, and on the windowsill, something waited. A small wooden toy car, its paint chipped to the raw pine underneath, one wheel missing. Exactly like the one Eli used to roll across the church pews while I worked, down the aisle, back again, the tiny squeak of the wheel marking each return. He called it the Traveler. I picked it up. The grain of the wood was smooth where a thumb had worn it down long ago. On the underside, carved with a penknife, were the letters E.H. Eli Hayes. The world tilted. I sank onto the floor, the toy in my palm, trying to breathe around the tightness in my throat. I could still hear the faint echo of that wheel turning against oak. Squeak! Pause! Squeak! The same rhythm as the footsteps in the hall. Later that day, I went to return the toy to Mrs. Gable, thinking maybe it belonged to one of her grandchildren. She shook her head. "No kids have been here for months. Not since the storm last year." Then she added, almost gently, "Maybe it's your little one paying you a visit. The dead don't like to be forgotten." I wanted to laugh, but it came out as a sob. When I got home, I set the toy beside the radio. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept glancing at it, half afraid it might move. That night, I dreamed of the fire again, the beams collapsing like knees giving way, the sound of Eli calling my name through the smoke. When I woke, the smell of burnt wood still lingered, and from somewhere in the dark came the faint hum of the radio tuning itself. I didn't move. I just listened, the way I used to when he was alive. The hum steadied, then stopped, replaced by a single tap on the window. And then another, and another. I whispered, "What do you want?" The glass stayed silent, but I already knew the answer. Some echoes don't fade. They find their way back step by step until you open the door. Because sometimes, the one knocking isn't a stranger. It's a memory trying to find its way home. Saturday night. The air had that kind of stillness that feels watched. I couldn't sleep. Every tick of the clock seemed to echo too loud against the walls. So I went downstairs, more out of exhaustion than courage, and stood in front of the old Zenith radio. Its surface was a patchwork of time, one corner blistered from the fire, the brass dial dulled to a tired amber. Dust lined the vents like ash that had never settled properly. I hadn't touched it in months. Maybe years. But something in the silence asked me to. I plugged it in. The outlet sparked faintly. The radio hummed. For a second, I expected the usual static, the soft hiss I'd come to mistake for company. But what came instead froze the air in my lungs. A child's voice. Clear, fragile, alive. "Mama, if I get lost, will you come find me?" The sentence played clean, no distortion, no hiss. Every syllable carried weight, his breath, the slight catch on the F of find. It was Eli's voice, not a memory, not a trick of tape. Now. My knees gave way. I hit the floor, palms scraping against the wooden boards. I wanted to stop listening, but I couldn't. The radio clicked again, as if rewinding itself, and the same line repeated. Slower this time, almost pleading. Mama, if I get lost, will you come find me? I tore the cord from the wall. The voice kept playing. Panic rose through me like smoke. I grabbed the radio and threw it against the ground. The casing split, knobs scattering like teeth. Still, the speaker crackled. Faint, broken, gasping. Mama. And then, from outside, the same voice. I turned toward the window. The curtains moved, though the air was still. Mama, please, I'm cold. I felt my throat close. My mind screamed, number. Not again. But my body moved anyway. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain open. There he was. The boy. Same thin frame, same pale skin glowing against the dark. Barefoot in the yard, standing exactly where Eli used to chase fireflies. His lips were trembling, but his eyes, those eyes were steady, focused on me as if he'd been waiting for me to notice. Who are you? I shouted. What do you want from me? He flinched at the noise, then shook his head. When he spoke, the voice came out softer than breath. I just want to come home. The window pane fogged with each word. On the glass, I could see his reflection overlaying mine. An image I couldn't separate anymore. Every instinct told me to open the window, to let him in. But fear has its own gravity. It pinned my hands to the sill. I whispered, half to him, half to the ghosts that have lived in my chest for decades. You're not real. The boy stepped closer. The streetlight caught the curve of his cheek. He lifted his hand and pressed it against the glass. His palm was warm. The print bloomed red beneath it. At first, I thought it was mud again. But when the droplets began to slide down the window, thick and dark, I realized it was blood. My body moved before my mind could. I ran outside, barefoot, into the cold. The yard was empty. Only the smell of metal hung in the air, sharp and wrong. The radio inside had gone silent at last, but on the ground beside it, one of its broken knobs kept rolling in a slow, small circle like it hadn't finished turning. I looked down at my hands. There were faint smudges of red on my fingertips, though I hadn't touched the glass. The police would later find nothing. No prints, no signs of a break-in, no blood anywhere. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a trick of light. It wasn't grief. Because when I touched the spot on the glass where his hand had been, it was still warm, as if the world itself hadn't decided yet whether he was real or not. And for the first time in 43 years, I realized something terrifying. If that voice could cross over to me, maybe I could cross over to it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the faint red smear that refused to fade, listening to the faint hum of wires cooling inside the broken radio. I kept replaying his words in my head. Mama, if I get lost, will you come find me? I whispered back, so quietly even I could barely hear it. I'm trying. And then, in the stillness that followed, I could have sworn I heard it. A child's sigh, soft and human, somewhere between the walls and the wind. I thought I was talking to a ghost, until I saw the real blood on the glass. Morning came like a lie. The world outside my window looked clean, ordinary birds on the wire, sun in the curtains, yet the memory of blood still burned behind my eyes. I called the police. 2 officers came. Young, polite, wearing the kind of expressions reserved for fragile things. They moved through the house like tourists in someone else's sadness, their shoes squeaking on the floorboards I'd scrubbed raw hours earlier. One of them, the taller one, glanced at the glass where the handprint had been. Nothing. Not a smear, not a trace. The surface gleamed spotless, though I hadn't cleaned it. No signs of forced entry, ma'am. He was standing right there, I said, pointing to the patch of grass outside. There was blood. Maybe an animal? Animals don't call me mama. They exchanged looks over my head, the kind that says, don't upset her. The shorter one softened his voice, the way people talk to widows and ghosts. Mrs. Hayes, are you sure you're feeling okay? I wanted to tell him no, that sanity had stopped being a relevant measure sometime around 1982. Instead, I smiled the way people do when they know no one believes them. When they left, The house felt smaller. The silence pressed in close. Even the dust seemed to hold its breath. I sat in the chair by the broken radio for a long time, watching sunlight crawl across the floorboards. No blood, no prints, no proof. Just me. And the question that had become a pulse under my skin, was it really him? If I couldn't trust my eyes, I'd trust the only thing I ever understood. Sound. I unplugged the radio, carried it to the table, and began to work. The back screws were rusted in place, reluctant to open after 4 decades of keeping secrets. When the panel finally gave, the smell of burnt wire drifted up, a scent both mechanical and heartbreakingly human. Inside, the circuits were half melted, but the speaker cone still intact, black paper puckered like scar tissue. I cleaned it carefully, wiping away years of dust, my hands steady for the first time in days. As I worked, I spoke to him, the way I used to when soldering cables while he played under the desk. "You remember this part, Eli? You always wanted to push the red button." A memory answered. His laugh, bright and brief as a struck note. By afternoon, I had it reassembled. The Zenith looked almost dignified again, old, yes, but ready. I set up a new microphone beside it, connected it to my digital recorder. If he spoke again, I would catch every breath, every frequency. Before pressing record, I stared at the empty hallway reflected in the radio's glass. I could see myself there too. Hair unkempt, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, still wearing the same sweater from the night before. I hardly recognized the woman looking back. "If this is Eli's voice," I whispered, "I'll listen to the end. And if it's not," I promised, "I'll silence it forever." That was my vow. Not to the police, not to the church, but to the sound itself. When night came, I prepared the room. No lights, no distractions. Only the low hum of electricity and my own breathing. I sat beside the radio, notebook open, red pen ready to mark every anomaly. At 2012 a.m., the house began to change. A faint current passed through the floor, the kind of vibration that lives beneath hearing. The radio crackled, once like a throat clearing. Then, nothing. 5 minutes, 10, 20, I kept listening. Grief has patience. It teaches you to wait through static. At last, a single tone slipped through, a low frequency I recognized from the old choir recordings. The A note, 440 hertz, the universal key of tuning. It held steady for 6 seconds, then faded. My hand shook as I wrote it down. 408s. The pitch of beginnings. Eli used to hum that note whenever he was nervous, the way some people bite their nails. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidences don't hum in your dead son's key. The next night, I recorded again. And again. Each time the tone came clearer, sometimes layered with faint breathing, sometimes with what sounded like the scrape of small fingers on wood. I began cataloging everything: time, decibel, pattern. I wasn't just listening now. I was investigating. Days blurred into nights. Coffee turned to cold sludge beside me. The house filled with tapes labeled 212, Eli. Test 4, unknown frequency, child register. Somewhere between exhaustion and obsession, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever this was, ghost, machine, memory. It had reached out to me first, and I intended to answer. I caught my reflection again in the dark radio glass, a faint echo of my younger self in the studio all those years ago, when Eli shouted, "Mama!" into the microphone and laughed at the echo. Only now, I was the echo, and he was the voice calling back. That night marked the end of my fear, and the beginning of my hunt for truth. Because, if no one else would listen to what I heard, then I'd make the world hear it for me. For 3 nights straight, the house stayed silent. No knocks at 2001-2. No footsteps in the hall. Only the creak of old wood expanding in the cold, and my breath, measured against the dark. I told myself it was over. That whatever had reached for me through the radio had retreated back to wherever grief goes when it's done feeding. But the tape said otherwise. Each morning I replayed the previous night's recording. At first, just the hum of empty air, Then, buried deep beneath the hiss, a sound that didn't belong. A soft inhale. Then another, a rhythm too steady to be wind. And then, faintly, a child's sob. It wasn't the clear voice I'd heard before. This was closer, smaller, like a boy crying with his face pressed into cloth. I adjusted the levels, looped the segment, listened again. The static thickened around the sound like it was trying to smother it, but I could still hear the broken gasps between each breath. Once there was even a whisper, one word, blurred, wet with tears. Here. That was all, a single syllable barely audible. But it came from somewhere inside this house. The realization slithered through me. The voice wasn't in the recording had caught what the walls were already hearing. I followed the hum. Down the hallway, past Eli's old door, the one I never open, and toward the back of the kitchen, where the floorboards change from oak to cement. There, hidden beneath a worn rug, is the narrow wooden hatch that leads to the basement. I hadn't opened it in 43 years. The hinges had fused to rust, the latch stiff with paint. I had sealed it myself the week after the fire, promising I'd never go down again. The fire had started below, they'd said. Nothing good waited down there, but the sound was waiting now. That night, I set up the recorder beside the hatch and pressed record. Then I turned off every light and waited in the dark. Minutes passed. The air thickened. From beneath the floor came a new noise, subtle at first, then certain. Knocking. 3 slow knocks spaced evenly apart. Then silence. Then the sound of something dragging softly across concrete, followed by a short, sharp cry cut off halfway. I wanted to run. Instead, I reached for the flashlight. The metal felt cold and too heavy in my shaking hand. The beam trembled as I aimed it at the hatch. Dust floated in the cone of light, turning the air into a slow snowfall. I knelt, pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. Only the faint hum of the recorder and my pulse thrumming through my skull. "Eli?" I whispered. No answer, but the air smelled faintly of smoke. I unlatched the hatch. The hinges screamed as it opened, a cry like metal remembering pain. A staircase descended into darkness, steep and narrow. The flashlight beam caught particles of ash still clinging to the walls. My heart felt too big for my chest. Step by step, I went down. The air grew colder, thicker. My breath clouded in front of me. At the bottom, the light fell on a metal trunk shoved against the far wall. Its surface was gray, pitted and sealed with layers of tape yellowed by time. For a moment, I couldn't move. That trunk hadn't been there the day of the fire, or at least, no one had told me it was. The flashlight trembled over its lid. Someone had written a word across the tape in faded black ink. The letters were warped, but I could still read them. Property of Seat Cecilia. My stomach turned cold. That was the church's storage mark, the same used on their recording equipment. Why would it be here, in my basement? The sobs on the tape echoed in my mind. I knelt closer. The smell of old smoke was stronger here, mixed with something metallic rust or maybe dried blood. When I pressed my palm against the lid, it was warm. I jerked back. The flashlight flickered. From inside the trunk came a sound, so faint I almost missed it. A single breath, drawn in slowly, held, then released. Then silence again. I stumbled backward, hit the wall, the flashlight clattering to the ground. Its beam spun wild across the ceiling, catching the edges of something carved there long ago. Scratches, small and deliberate, spelling 3 letters. EH3. Eli Hayes, H3. He had learned to write his initials that year. I'd shown him how, guiding his hand with mine. My knees gave out. I sat on the cold floor shaking, the trunk in front of me like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. Upstairs, the recorder still ran. Through the floorboards, I could hear its faint click, capturing this silence, this breath, this proof. For the first time, I wanted the tape to stop, because whatever I had found down here wasn't just sound anymore. It was alive. The trunk opened with a sound that didn't belong to metal, more like breath escaping after years of being held in. Dust billowed up, blinding me for a moment. I coughed into my sleeve. the beam of the flashlight slicing through the haze. Inside were folders, stacked in neat precision, each wrapped in wax paper that had melted at the edges. The topmost one was stamped with a faded red seal, St. Cecilia Hospital, 1982. My name was on the corner label. So was Eli's. My fingers trembled as I lifted the first sheet. The paper flaked with age. Across the top was a typewritten note, patient transferred. 1982, Louisiana Orphanage. Transferred. Not deceased. Transferred. For a long time I couldn't breathe. The word blurred, shifting between meanings. I whispered to the empty air. No. No, they told me he died. I flipped through the file, page after page. Medical notes, hearing test results, recordings of frequencies. Frequencies I used in the studio to measure pitch accuracy. At the bottom of the stack, a new name appeared in fresh ink. Eli Hayes, adopted under name Michael Drew. I sat back hard against the concrete wall. The flashlight rolled away, casting the papers into strange gold light. Somewhere above me, the house creaked, as if it too was listening. Michael Drew. The name scratched through my brain like a wrong note, and then it clicked. The boy outside, the voice, the plea. It hadn't been a haunting. It had been a call home. The child calling Mama wasn't my ghost. He was my son. But how? I turned to the rest of the trunk. Beneath the files lay a reel-to-reel tape recorder, smaller than the one I used in the studio, its metal casing scorched but intact. A label clung to it, half-burned. Project Orphans. Rebirth. Audio Rehabilitation Program. St. Cecilia. My stomach twisted. I remembered the whispers after the fire. Talk of the church experimenting with therapeutic sound for deaf children, of special funding that vanished when the fire broke out. Back then, I hadn't listened. I'd been too busy burying my son. I pressed play. At first, only static. Then, a voice. Older, male, coldly professional. Test sequence 42. Subject. EH displays exceptional frequency retention. Continue auditory isolation for observation. A second voice followed, small and scared. I want Mama. Then the first voice again, sharper. Begin tone exposure. The speaker emitted a high frequency so sharp it pierced through decades of dust. I clamped my hands over my ears, but I could still hear the boy's whimpering beneath it. Then silence. I shut the recorder off and stumbled backward until I hit the stairs. Tears blurred my vision, salt stinging my lips. They had taken him, not the fire, them. They had turned my son into an experiment. When I finally reached the kitchen, dawn was leaking through the blinds, pale and indifferent. The papers trembled in my hands. My body moved on instinct. I dialed St. D. Cecilia. The number still worked. A voice answered, polite, female. St. Cecilia Cathedral, good morning. This is Lorraine Hayes. I need to speak to Father Donnelly. A pause. I'm sorry, ma'am. Father Donnelly passed away in 1993. Then, whoever replaced him. A shuffle of papers. Then another voice came on, older, wary. This is Father Miller. How may I help you? You can start by telling me what you did with my son. Silence. Then the sound of a chair creaking, a throat clearing. Mrs. Hayes, perhaps we should speak in person. I was already grabbing my coat. The church looked smaller than I remembered, but it still smelled the same old candles, polished brass, the faint sweetness of mold under the organ loft. Father Miller met me near the altar, his smile tight. I laid the file on the pew between us. You people said he died. You gave me ashes. Mrs. Hayes, please. You lied. He glanced at the folder, eyes flicking over the burned seal. Where did you get this? From my basement, where you left it. For a moment the mask cracked. He looked truly afraid. Then he straightened, adopting the tone priests use when they think God is on their side. The Orphans Rebirth Project was before my time. It was misguided. We believed auditory isolation could rewire damaged hearing, help children born deaf regain sound recognition. Many were volunteers. Volunteers? I cut him off. You think a 6-year-old volunteered to be burned alive? He stepped back, palms raised. No one was supposed to die. The fire was unfortunate. I slammed my hand on the pew so hard the echo startled us both. You stole him from me. You erased his name. For a heartbeat I saw the pity in his eyes, and the calculation behind it. Mrs. Hayes, after so many years, perhaps it's kinder to believe he passed peacefully. Kinder? My voice cracked, laughter breaking through tears. You call it kindness when you bury a child alive? He didn't answer. The silence between us filled the church like smoke. Finally, he said softly, even if what you say were true, those records are sealed. That boy, Michael Drew, is an adult now. You'd be opening wounds that were meant to stay closed. Then let them bleed, I said. At least the blood will be real this time. I gathered the files and walked out before he could bless me with excuses. Back home, I spread everything across the kitchen table. Medical charts, adoption certificates, frequency graphs. And one photograph burned at the corner, but clear enough. A boy in a white hospital gown, small headphones over his ears, looking up at the camera with confusion and trust. On the back, in red pen, EH, responds to maternal stimuli. My breath left me. Maternal stimuli. That's what they called my voice. They'd used recordings of me to condition him. Every time he heard, "Mama," it wasn't comfort. It was training. All these years, his voice calling me through the radio wasn't haunting. It was memory playback. He'd been programmed to call for me, over and over, trapped inside the echo of a mother's name. I fell to my knees, pressing the photo to my chest. The house around me felt alive again, whispering through its cracks. "Mama?" This time I didn't flinch. I looked toward the hallway, where the air shimmered faintly, as if someone small had just walked by. And I whispered back, "I'm here, Eli. I'm still listening." For a moment, the floor vibrated under my hands, the same low hum that had haunted the recordings. Only now, it wasn't frightening. It was familiar. I realized then that I had spent 43 years believing the fire had burned my son. But the truth was simpler, crueler. It wasn't Eli who died in that fire. It was my faith. In God, in truth, in mercy. Everything that followed had only been the echo. I found the address printed at the bottom of one of the files: Louisiana State Orphanage, Division of Speech Therapy. Except when I arrived, the brass sign on the gate said something else entirely: Haven Institute for Auditory Research. The same building. Different name. Different lie. The guard at the front desk didn't even look up when I entered. I handed him the old hospital file. "I'm here to see Michael Drew." He frowned at the paper, then at me. "There's no one here by that name, ma'am." "Then you might check under another, Eli Hayes." That got his attention. He reached for the phone. A moment later, a woman in a white lab coat appeared, her smile as clean as sterilized metal. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Dr. Waller. Perhaps we can talk in my office?" Her office smelled of antiseptic and lemon polish, the kind of smell that insists on being trusted. On one wall hung glossy photos of children wearing headsets, eyes closed, serene. Underneath, teaching the deaf to hear again. "We're a rehabilitation center," she explained. "Many of our participants come from difficult backgrounds." "Participants," I repeated, "not children? Some are adults now, including Michael Drew?" She paused too long. That was all the answer I needed. "You took him from St. Cecilia," I said. "You used my voice to train him." Her smile thinned. "Mrs. Hayes, those projects are confidential." "Perhaps it would be better." From somewhere down the corridor came a sound that cut her sentence clean in half. A boy's voice, rising through an intercom speaker. "Mama, if I get lost, will you come find me?" The same sentence. The same inflection. My blood turned to ice. Dr. Waller moved for the switch. "That's a demo for our donors," she said quickly. "Part of our voice recognition program for the visually impaired. We call it MAMA." The word left my mouth before she could finish. It was printed across a brochure on her desk. MAMI. A voice-activated comfort system for the elderly and the blind. Powered by Rebirth Labs. I stared at the glossy photo, a silver speaker shaped like a cradle, slogan beneath it. Because every soul deserves to hear a mother's voice. My hands shook. That's his voice, I whispered. You turned my son into a product. Dr. Waller's tone cooled. Mrs. Hayes, please understand, these recordings are public domain samples. No one owns a frequency. No, I said, but someone owns a child. I ran. Through the hallway, past the photos, following the sound of that familiar voice. It led me to a glass door marked Studio 3, restricted. Behind the glass, a small figure sat in front of a microphone. A young boy, no older than 10, wearing the same model of headphones Eli once wore. Beside him, a technician adjusted dials, nodding each time the boy spoke. Say it again, Michael. Mama. Louder. Mama. Every syllable was my past resurrected. The cadence, the breath, even the tiny crack on the second syllable. Perfectly, impossibly, Eli. I pushed open the door. The technician spun around. You can't be in here. I ignored him, stepping toward the boy. Michael? He looked up, blue eyes, the same blue, but blank, unknowing. Do you know who I am? I asked. You're the observer, he said uncertainly, repeating a phrase he'd been taught. Something in me splintered. No, I said softly. I'm the voice you've been answering. Before I could reach him, security swarmed the doorway. 2 guards grabbed my arms, dragging me backward. The boy's face crumpled, confused by the noise. Mama? He said again, frightened now. Dr. Waller appeared behind the guards, calm as stone. Please remove her. She's trespassing. I fought against them, shouting, You hear that? He called me Mama. You can steal his name, his life, but his voice still knows mine. One of the guards hissed, You don't have any rights here. He doesn't remember you. I stopped struggling and stared straight into his face. But his voice remembers me. They froze, not from fear, but from something else. The boy inside had begun to cry, calling for Mama again and again, the sound echoing through the hall speakers until the building itself seemed to beg. They pushed me outside into the sunlight, slammed the doors behind me. I stood there shaking, the files clutched against my chest. Through the glass facade I could still hear muffled sobs. I thought I'd won something by finding him. But the truth was worse than any haunting. They turned his need for me into a program. For the rest of that day, I wandered the city in a daze. Everywhere I went, I heard snippets of his voice. Department store demos, automated greetings, a commercial on a passing bus. Welcome home, Mama. I'm here, Mama. Don't be afraid, Mama. The words followed me like ghosts made of data. Eli's innocence repackaged for comfort, for profit. By nightfall, I was back home, sitting in the dark, the old Zenith radio in front of me. It felt ancient now, almost sacred, a relic of when sound still belonged to people. I switched it on. Static filled the room, soft and familiar. Then, faintly underneath, Mama, are you listening? I pressed record. The next morning, I printed every document I had and mailed copies to every journalist, lawyer, and news station in Louisiana. Half of them would think I was insane. The other half, I hoped, might remember my name from the fire. Within a week, things began to move. A local paper ran a story, Church Experiment linked to audio technology firm. 2 days later, the online version disappeared. The reporter's number went dead. Then the calls began, no voice on the other end, just breathing. At night, a car idled outside my house with its lights off. They wanted me to stop. But they'd taken everything once already, there was nothing left to lose. One evening, the doorbell rang. A man in a dark suit stood there, polite smile, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Hayes, I'm from Rebirth Labs. We understand you may be in possession of proprietary material. Proprietary? I repeated. You mean my child's voice? Those recordings were created under institutional funding. They are property of the company. Then take me to court, I said. and closed the door in his face. That night, I copied all the files onto flash drives and hid them in different places. The freezer, the mailbox of an empty house down the street, even inside the hollow of Eli's old toy car. If they came for me, at least the truth would scatter faster than they could erase it. A week later, I received an anonymous email. Subject line: "Do you still want to see Michael Drew?" Attached was a photo-grainy, low light. A young man, maybe 20, sitting in a recording booth. Headphones on. Eyes closed. Caption: "He's still here. I knew that studio. It was the one I'd built decades ago under St. Teen. Cecilia's choir loft. The church had reopened it as a private research wing. I printed the photo and pinned it above my desk. This time, I wasn't shaking. I was planning. They thought I was an old woman haunted by ghosts. They were right, but I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I had a voice recorder, a set of old studio contacts, and the one thing their algorithms could never simulate: memory. And I was going to use all of it. I didn't plan to steal anything. I only meant to listen. But grief has a way of turning into strategy. It waits, sharpens, learns your patience. And that's how, one night, I found myself sitting in the public library, my hands shaking over a borrowed laptop, using an old access code I'd memorized from the folder stamped Project Orphan's Rebirth. The code still worked. Of course it did. The church may have rebranded. The orphanage may have changed its name, but their digital ghosts were still walking in the same corridors. A portal opened. Rebirth Labs' internal archive. Rows of file names filled the screen, each tagged with a number and a year. I scrolled until I saw it: 1982, subject EH, maternal response data. I clicked. The download bar crawled across the screen, agonizingly slow. When it finished, a folder bloomed open, hundreds of sound files, each no longer than 10 seconds. I clicked one. Static, then a voice. "Mama." The same whisper that had followed me for 43 years. Then another file. "Don't cry, Mama." Then another. "Where are you?" The timestamps were all the same day, the day of the fire. My throat closed. I clicked on the metadata. Each file had been marked with additional labels. Dataset: Mama AI v4 usage, neural voice training model, empathy response synthesis. Client: Seraph Health Technologies. My vision blurred. Seraph Health, one of the biggest biotech companies in the state. I'd seen their commercials on TV, promising human comfort through artificial compassion. I opened their website in another tab. Front page, smiling patients in hospital beds, speaking to small white speakers shaped like teardrops. A slogan beneath: "Let someone you love speak comfort into your healing." They were selling empathy. They were selling him. The files weren't just research. They were inventory. I scrolled deeper and found licensing documents, contracts between Rebirth Labs and Seraph Health, lines of legal jargon that made me sick, audio samples from deceased minors to be repurposed for synthetic voice development. Source anonymity guaranteed. Compensation: $1.25 per vocal second, $1.25. That's what my son's voice was worth to them. I don't remember standing. I just know I was suddenly outside, the cool air hitting me like a slap. Cars passed, people talked, the world kept going, utterly normal. And I stood there realizing that the most sacred thing I'd ever had. His voice had been copied, coded, and sold by subscription. That night, back home, I downloaded every file to a flash drive. I listened to them all, hundreds of fragments, hundreds of versions of the same word. Mama, 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 each one slightly different, some higher, some slower, all him. Every variant had been algorithmically processed until it no longer sounded human, but something in me could still tell which syllable was his first, which was recorded after he'd cried. By dawn, the house was filled with his voice, layered, distorted, endless. I sat among the echoes, rocking slightly, the flash drive warm in my palm. I thought of how I used to tell him, "Sound never really disappears, Eli. It just travels so far we can't hear it anymore." I hadn't realized then that the world would one day find a way to drag those sounds back, not to remember, but to own. I stared at the glowing screen, at the logo of Seraph Health spinning like a halo. And something inside me hardened. Not grief this time, but purpose. If they could build an empire on the voice of a stolen child, then I could burn that empire down with his words. I opened a new recording on my phone. The red light blinked. "My name is Lorraine Hayes," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "And this?" I held up the flash drive. "Is my son's soul. You turned it into a product." I pressed stop. That clip would go viral soon enough. I used to think the fire had taken everything. Now I understood. It only started burning. The real blaze was here, spreading through wires and servers and contracts, devouring the very meaning of mother. I turned off the laptop and sat in the dark, the only light coming from the old Zenith radio across the room. Its dial glowed faintly, as if it too had heard everything. I whispered, "They found a way to make you live forever, Eli, but not the way you deserved." The radio crackled, just once, like a sigh. And in that sound, I swore I heard him answer. Not words this time, just the quiet grief of a child who finally knew what they'd done to him. I called Jack first, my old colleague from the cathedral, the one who used to joke that he could EQ a confession into a hymn. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep and memory. "Lorraine, it's 3 a.m, what's wrong? I need a favor. I need the studio, and I need you sober. You've never asked for me to be anything else." By noon, we were back in a room that smelled like the past. Coffee, spliced tape, and a faint ghost of solder. The studio wasn't much. A community center converted from an old warehouse. But it had monitors that still trusted me, and more importantly, people who would take my voice seriously. The plan came fast once the shock settled into something colder. I would not beg the church or the company for justice. I would force the truth into ears that couldn't be bought. I would make people listen. I called it, in a fever of naming things, Voices Returned. An exhibition of sound, side-by-side demonstrations of the original recordings and the commercialized, AI-synthesized versions. Panels with printouts of contracts, screenshots of licensing agreements, and a live demonstration that would expose the difference between a stolen voice and a lived voice. And I would be the one to stitch it together. There were practical things, because grief alone does not build an exhibit. There were cables and permits and people to convince. There were days when my hands shook so badly I couldn't thread a 144 jack, but I kept going. Technical prep. Jack and I spent afternoons reacquainting ourselves with equipment I'd not touched in decades. We tuned monitors, swapped out decayed capacitors, and cleaned the Zenith until the wood shone like a promise. I relearned the feel of the red record light, the satisfying click of a well-seated XLR. We set up 2 identical playback chains, one labeled Archive, my originals, the other Synth. The Seraph Rebirth files I'd stolen. Both ran through the same preamp and the same pair of monitors, so no one could say the playback quality explained the difference. I practiced EQ like prayer. There's an art to removing tape hiss without killing the life in a voice, to lifting a vowel so the human tremor, that ragged edge of breath, shows through. I spent hours with the spectrograph, tracing Eli's harmonics, the slight nasal in his M, the way his A rounded off on the third syllable. Those were fingerprints. Machines could approximate them. They could not recreate the small, frightened hitch that came when he tried to say, "My name in the dark." Assembling evidence. I printed the licensing clauses, the line about 1.25 per vocal second, and mounted them on boards. I made a spreadsheet of files with timestamps, sources, and client names. I laminated screenshots of Rebirth's interface showing Mama AI V4 and Seraph Health's marketing materials. Every piece of paper was a stone to throw through their polished windows. I also duplicated the audio onto multiple drives and hid copies in places an old woman knows well to hide things. Inside the lining of Eli's toy car, taped under the underside of the church pew I once polished, slipped into a Bible at the public library. Paranoia is a tool when you have only one truth to protect: my own voice. There was one move I hesitated over until the last possible moment: recording myself. Not a statement to the press. I'd done that, but a raw, unedited cry, the sound of a mother breaking. I set up the mic in the booth, alone, the red light watching me like a small sun. I pressed start and let myself go. At first, it was a thin, useless noise, the way the throat protests the idea of crying on cue. But then memory took over. I let the tape take whatever it wanted. I sobbed until the sound had texture, little hiccups, a long exhale, a stuttering syllable that landed exactly where Eli's breath used to land before his maw. When I played it back, it sounded like the center of me, and I knew that lodged inside that sound was the proof of relationship. Breath matched to breath, tempo of lullabies, the rhythmic pattern that no algorithm could invent. I layered that cry under a short montage, my original tape of Eli's mama, a clean snippet from the Seraph files, and then my live cry. The transitions were surgical. The audience would hear the sanctity, the theft, and then the human cost laid bare. My voice, raw, pulling the machine-made voice like a ragged thread. Logistics and allies. I reached out to the old reporter who hadn't dead-ended his phone number after the first story. Maria. She owed me. In her office we plotted the opening night and the outreach. She promised a column, and she promised to bring a freelancer with a camera. I made contact with a lawyer who worked pro bono for whistleblowers. He advised caution. Subpoenas and restraining orders and the ugly business of law. But he also smiled when I told him my plan. Exposure in public is sometimes the best subpoena. We booked a week-long slot at the community hall. We hung panels. We rigged 2 listening booths, one for archive and one for synth, soundproofed with moving blankets on old foam. We printed program cards explaining how to listen. Close your eyes. Notice the breath. Where does the human tremor live? We planned a live moment at precisely 7:13 p.m. On opening night, I would play a reel that had never been heard publicly. The reel from 1982 with unedited artifacts intact. Then, immediately after, the synthetic version would play. Then, I would step out from the booth and speak. I rehearsed my speech until the words became immunity. Short, factual, then devastating. The contracts, the price, the science, the theft. The final line I practiced until it sat like a stone in my mouth, that the people selling comfort had instead sold my son. Security and risk. We expected pushback. Rebirth Labs and Seraph had lawyers. They had money. We had cheap locks and stubbornness. Jack rigged encrypted backups. Maria scheduled live streams so the moment could not be quietly scrubbed from the internet. The lawyer warned me not to invite Michael. If he was still Michael publicly, the boy might be an adult now, and he might suffer more for the spectacle. I nodded, although part of me, animal and foolish, wanted him on the stage in the light so the world could see the consequence of their work. Final rehearsal. 2 nights before opening, the studio smelled of hot coffee and burned toast. We ran the sequence on repeat, adjusting levels. Archive loud enough to be visceral, synthetic clean and smooth, my cry underneath like a needle. Jack tightened a screw on the Zenith's cabinet and said quietly, "You're going to make them listen." I wanted to say I already had, once, when I first pressed play and heard Eli's voice. But what I'd done now was different. This was not pleading. This was a summons. On opening night, people would come out of curiosity. They would leave either outraged or incredulous. Either way, the recordings would be out in the world. People would talk. Lawyers would have to answer. Investors would get nervous. Because sometimes the only thing that shames a machine is the stubborn, messy evidence of the human. And if they stole my son's voice, then I would not let them sell silence in its place. If they eat my son's voice, I will let the whole world hear the truth. The hall was full long before the doors officially opened. I could feel the weight of them. Reporters, students, strangers, skeptics. all pressing forward toward the sound booths, phones raised, the air electric with the promise of scandal. Everywhere I looked, cables ran like veins across the floor. My zenith sat at the center on a low pedestal, a brass plaque beneath it reading, "Voices returned, curated by Lorraine Hayes." I had expected curiosity. I hadn't expected reverence. The audience whispered like they were in church. Maria, the journalist, was already live streaming. Jack gave me a subtle nod from the sound desk. "We're rolling." Then the lights dimmed. A spotlight washed over the stage, and the first recording began. A child's voice, unfiltered, raw, trembling with life, filled the hall. "Mama!" There was a gasp somewhere in the crowd. Then another clip. "Don't cry, Mama. I'm here." The sound was fragile, imperfect, and that's what made it human. People clutched their headphones tighter, some closing their eyes. Then, seamlessly, I cued the second half. The synthetic playback from Seraph's Mama device. Same words, same sequence, but smoother, flatter. A perfection that was eerie, soulless. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The uncanny difference was unmistakable. I stepped into the light. "You've just heard two voices," I said, the mic amplifying every tremor of my breath. "One belongs to a 6-year-old boy recorded in 1982. The other was sold to you last year as a therapeutic sound for hospital patients. They are, according to corporate records, the same frequency, the same DNA of sound." A murmur spread across the crowd. Flashlights blinked like fireflies. "That boy's name was Eli Hayes," I continued. "My son. Taken from me under a church experiment called Project Orphan's Rebirth, then repurposed by Rebirth Labs into an AI voice system. They called it comfort technology. I call it grave robbing." Gasps. Phones rose higher. On the screen behind me, I projected the contract. 125 per vocal second. I didn't need to explain more. The number alone hit harder than any sermon. Jack signaled from the back, 2 fingers in the air. "They're here." And when I turned, I saw them. Rebirth's representatives, dark suits, corporate badges, flanked by security. They stood near the exit, trying to look calm. But their eyes flicked nervously between the crowd and the cameras. I leaned toward the mic. "You wanted to talk about intellectual property," I said. "Let's talk about what happens when a mother reclaims hers." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Halfway through the exhibit, while I guided people through the listening booths, Maria whispered in my ear, "Lorraine, there's someone here you need to see." I turned, and the world tilted. At the back of the hall, flanked by 2 caregivers from the Haven Institute, stood a young man. Early 20s. Pale. Quiet. His eyes were the same blue that had followed me through every nightmare. "Michael Drew," Maria said softly. He wasn't a boy anymore. But when our eyes met, I recognized the small tremor in his lip. The same hesitation Eli used to have before he mispronounced a word. My chest ached so hard it felt like my ribs were trying to open. The crowd parted for him as if instinctively. Cameras lowered. Even the reporters went silent. He stopped a few feet from the stage. His hands shook at his sides. "Do you know me?" he asked quietly. The caregivers shifted, unsure if they should intervene. I nodded slowly, tears blurring the light. "I knew you before you had a name." He frowned, a child trying to reach through fog. "They said you were just a voice, a test pattern. And they told me you were dead." A murmur rippled through the audience. I stepped closer, voice trembling but clear. "If you can really hear me, Eli, if any part of you remembers the sound of home, then answer me now." He hesitated. The silence stretched. The cameras waited. The world waiting with them. Then, through the hush, his voice broke open. "Mama, here I am." It wasn't English this time. It was the exact phrase from the 1982 recording. The old accent. The exact intonation. I felt my knees weaken. The hall went utterly still. No one breathed. No one dared speak. He stepped forward. His hands, still trembling, reached for mine. And then, He was crying, full, shaking sobs. I wrapped my arms around him, the way I'd been dreaming of for 43 years. His heartbeat drummed against my shoulder, proof that he was flesh and blood, not a ghost, not a recording. The microphones caught every sound of it, every breath, every tear, and broadcast it through the hall, echoing back like a hymn. The rebirth representatives tried to act. One of them moved toward the sound desk, hissing orders into an earpiece. But Maria intercepted them, shoving her press badge in their faces. You shut this down now, and the headline becomes, Corporation, Silences, Mother and Son Reunion. They froze. The audience turned on them. Phones recording, people shouting, You stole his life. How much did you sell her grief for? The room became a storm. Flashes, anger, applause, cries. Through it all, I held him tighter. When the noise finally softened, I took the mic again. My voice was raw but steady. You all saw it. You all heard it. Machines can replicate sound, but not recognition. Algorithms can mimic tone, but not memory. The moment he said, Mama, every line of code in the world collapsed. I turned toward the corporate men at the back. You wanted patents and ownership? Keep your contracts, keep your perfect simulations. I have something you'll never digitize. I looked at Eli, at Michael, at whatever name he chose to keep, and smiled. I don't need a DNA test. I just needed my son to call me once more. And this time, not through a radio. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. Somewhere outside, sirens began to wail, either police or corporate security, I couldn't tell. But it didn't matter anymore. Because for the first time since 1982, I wasn't hearing a recording. I was hearing him. After the chaos, people stayed, hundreds of them. They crowded around, wanting to touch the old Zenith, to see the files, to offer comfort or apologies. Journalists swarmed, but I barely heard them. Eli sat beside me on the stage, silent, eyes glazed with confusion and awe. He kept tracing the shape of the microphone stand with his fingers, like touching it made something in him remember. Did I really say that? He whispered. Yes, I said, 43 years ago. And you? You waited? I never stopped recording. He laughed then, the smallest, strangest laugh, like static turning into melody. By morning, the story had exploded. Mother exposes AI. Voice theft, church experiment, scandal reopens. News vans parked outside my house. Seraph Health stock crashed 12% overnight. Rebirth Labs issued a statement calling the incident an unfortunate emotional misunderstanding. But it was too late. The truth was everywhere. And so was his voice, not as a product, but as a person. Eli and I sat at the kitchen table, the old radio between us. The tape reel still turning lazily, playing the sounds that had started everything. He listened, expression unreadable. That's me? That's you, I sound. Happy. You were. You can be again. He looked at me then, eyes clearer than they'd been in decades. Can we record something new? Yes, I said. But this time, you choose the words. He thought for a moment, then smiled shyly. How about, I'm home, I pressed record. His voice filled the room, older, rougher, but alive. And for the first time, I let the radio run without stopping it. No edits, no filters, just truth. The house is quiet again. For the first time in 43 years, the silence doesn't frighten me. Eli sits beside me by the old window, the same window where the knocking began. Morning light falls through the glass, dust drifting like soft snow. Outside, the oak trees bend slightly in the wind, the world pretending it hasn't changed. On the table, the Zenith radio sits unplugged, its dial frozen midway between stations. For decades, that little hum had been my heartbeat. Now, it's just wood and metal again, beautiful in its stillness. We've been sitting here a long time, not speaking, both of us listening to the quiet like it's a new language we have to learn. Finally, I ask, do you remember anything? He stares at his hands before answering. Not really, just pieces. Sounds. What kind of sounds? A woman singing sometimes. A door closing. Fire. Then nothing. His voice falters on the last word. I reach for his hand. He doesn't pull away. You don't have to remember, I whisper. You only have to begin again. He nods, still tracing the faint burn scar on his wrist, a mark the church called a medical tag. The light shifts, touching his face, and for a moment I see him as he once was. 6 years old, running barefoot through the choir loft, laughing at echoes. The sound memory inside me stirs, fragile but alive. He glances toward the unplugged radio. So, it's really off? Yes, I say. For good. Aren't you afraid it'll start again? No. Why? I place his hand over my chest, where the rhythm is steady and certain. Because the voice that mattered most is already here. He presses lightly, feeling the beat beneath his palm. I don't remember your face, he admits quietly, but I remember the sound. What sound? This. He taps once, twice, in rhythm with my heart. Mama. The word lands so softly it barely breaks the air. And somehow, it's enough. Later, we move to the kitchen. The window still rattles slightly when the wind changes. It always did. I pour him tea. He laughs at how my hands shake even now. You used to tell me never to waste sugar, he says suddenly. I freeze. How do you know that? I don't. It just came out. Memory is strange that way. It hides in muscle, in breath, in tones of voice. Some part of him still remembers how I said his name when I was tired, or how my sighs had a rhythm that matched the ocean outside New Orleans. He looks around the room, the peeling wallpaper, the piano that hasn't been tuned since the fire. It's smaller than I thought. Grief has a way of enlarging rooms, I say. He smiles at that. A small, uncertain smile that seems to come from someone who's been living underwater too long and has just surfaced. Are you angry at me? He asks suddenly. For what? For not remembering sooner. No, you were surviving. We sit there until the tea goes cold. In the afternoon, Jack stops by to check on the equipment we used for the exhibit. Reporters have been calling nonstop, Seraph Health's lawyers are already circling, but I don't care. Jack leaves a new hard drive on the counter, a backup of everything we played that night. Eli watches him go. He helped you find me? Yes. Then he saved us both. When the door closes, the quiet settles again, not the heavy silence of grief, but the kind that feels like a held breath before a song. Eli drags the chair closer to the window and sits facing the light. I can see his reflection in the glass, a ghost replaced by a living boy. He picks up the old microphone from the table. Can we record again? What would you like to say this time? Nothing. Just listen. He presses record, and for several seconds we simply breathe. No words, no ghosts, just the sound of being alive. When he stops the tape, I ask, what will you call this one? Home. Evening arrives slowly, melting the edges of everything gold. I light a candle by the radio, not out of fear, but gratitude. Its flame flickers once, as if bowing. Eli leans his head on my shoulder. Will you ever forgive them? No, I say honestly. But I'll stop letting them own my silence. He nods. We sit like that for a long time, the candle burning low, the day breathing out. There's peace here. The kind that doesn't come from forgetting, but from finally being heard. When he stands to leave the room, I stop him. Eli. He turns. Yes? Say it once more. Just so I know the world isn't dreaming. He smiles, that same small curve of the mouth I'd almost forgotten. Mama. The sound fills the space, not through speakers, not through static, but through air, through time, through blood. I look at the unplugged radio one last time, and for the first time in my life, I feel no urge to turn it on. Because the frequency I'd been searching for all these years isn't trapped in a machine anymore. It lives here. In this heartbeat, in this room, in this quiet. My voice doesn't need to travel through speakers anymore, I whisper. Because the one who needed to hear it is finally here. A year has passed since the exhibition. A year since the night the world heard the truth, and I heard my son call me again. The story made its rounds for a while. There were interviews, documentaries, podcasts, and then, like every headline, it faded. But for me, it didn't end. It changed form, from pain to purpose, from echo to instruction. That's how Echo Atelier began. It's a small studio on the edge of the city, nothing fancy, an old brick building that used to be a tailor's shop. The windows face the river, so in the afternoons, light dances across the floorboards like ripples of sound. I liked that. It felt right that the place should shimmer. Our sign out front is hand-painted, a little crooked. Echo. Atelier. Workshops in memory sound. For those who have lost someone but still remember their voice. Inside, there are shelves of old recorders, spools of magnetic tape, microphones from every decade. I teach people how to use them, how to chase the echoes left behind in old letters, voicemails, wind chimes, humming. Some students bring cracked cassettes. Some bring only silence. I teach them to listen until the silence hums back. It's never about summoning ghosts. It's about learning that sound is love's handwriting. It never quite fades, only travels. On the back wall behind my desk hangs the Zenith radio. I had it cleaned, polished, sealed inside a glass frame. Beneath it, a silver plate reads, "He spoke once. The world heard twice." People ask what that means. I tell them it's about how truth echoes, even when the voice that spoke it is gone. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I open the doors early just to breathe in the scent of metal and dust. The students trickle in with their notebooks and coffee cups. There's Ruth, a retired nurse who keeps replaying her husband's last voicemail. There's Naomi, who lost her sister in a flood and is trying to reconstruct her laugh from family videos. They sit in front of the microphones, nervous at first, as if afraid of what might answer back. Don't look for perfection, I tell them. Look for heartbeat. They record birds outside, the hum of their refrigerators, their own breathing. We layer the sounds together, build collages of memory. By the end of each class, the fear on their faces melts into wonder. They start to understand what I learned the hard way. The dead are never silent, they're just quiet enough to make us listen better. Once a week, Eli visits the studio. He still goes by Michael professionally. It's his name now, his choice. But here, among the microphones, I call him by the one that shaped him first. He's studying audio restoration at the community college. Sometimes he assists me in class, showing students how to isolate frequencies, how to filter background noise without erasing the soul of a recording. When he laughs, it's low and real, the opposite of the synthetic perfection that once stole him. Last month, he surprised me by bringing a new recording. It was a short piece he'd made, a simple loop of heartbeats blended with faint whispers of mama, home, and light. He called it Return Frequency. He played it during one of our sessions. The students cried. I did too. After everyone left, I asked, "Do you remember how to say the word that started it all?" He grinned. "I think I do." He stepped up to the mic, pressed record, and said softly, "Mama." No static, no interference, just air and truth. We listened together as the tape wound back, that single word filling the room with something vast and gentle. It didn't hurt anymore. It healed. Sometimes, journalists still find me. They want updates, new angles. They ask if I'm suing, if I've forgiven the church or the corporation. I tell them the same thing every time. The courts can handle justice. I'm handling the sound. Because for me, closure isn't silence. Closure is resonance. That point when two frequencies meet, and instead of canceling each other, they create harmony. On the anniversary of the exhibit, I hosted a small gathering at the atelier. Past students came, bringing recordings of their loved ones. We dimmed the lights, set the speakers low, and played each voice, one by one, until the room filled with the most extraordinary choir I'd ever heard. Not perfect, not polished, human. Laughter overlapping with sobs, whispered names tangled with rain and birdsong. Every sound said the same thing in a different language. I was here. I still am. When it ended, No one spoke for a long time. Then Ruth turned to me and asked, "Miss Lorraine, are you still afraid to turn on the radio?" I smiled. "No, I'm just afraid of silence." They laughed, but they understood. The kind of silence I meant wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that erases, the kind that forgets. That's the silence I fight. After everyone left, I sat alone in the studio. The candle I'd lit beneath the radio burned low, wax pooling like melted gold. I thought of all the years I'd spent waiting for a sound that might never come. All the static, all the sleepless nights. Now, every echo felt like a companion, not a haunting. I ran my fingers along the frame of the zenith. Its glass was cool. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to turn it on to feel close to him. Because the air around me already carried his tone. In memory, in breath, in the quiet pulse beneath everything. Eli called just then, his voice warm through the phone. "Hey Mama, the students loved today's session. I think you've started a movement." "No," I said, smiling. "Just teaching people how to listen." Before hanging up, he added softly, "You taught me too." Now, when night falls, I don't dread the darkness. I sit by the same window where the knocking once began. No ghost waits there anymore. Just the rustle of the wind, the hum of the river. Every so often, a sound will slick through the quiet. A child's laughter from the street below, a train whistle in the distance, and my heart will lift, thinking, he's still traveling through the air somewhere. I close my eyes and let the memory of that final night play again. The crowd, the lights, his arms around me. That was the moment I learned something no recording ever could. Love doesn't fade, it reverberates. You just have to tune to the right frequency. Tomorrow, I'll teach another class. Someone will bring a broken tape, someone else an empty one. We'll sit around the table, soldering wires, threading reels, turning grief into resonance. And I'll tell them what I always tell every new student who walks through the door. You're not here to find ghosts. You're here to remember that you're still capable of hearing. Outside, the river keeps moving, carrying echoes from the past out into the open air. Inside, the studio hums quietly, a living archive of every sound we've loved enough to save. I look once more at the inscription on the wall. Words etched into brass, gleaming in the afternoon sun. He spoke. Once. The world heard twice. They set up the camera in the corner of the studio. Just a small crew, 2 soft lights, the same microphone I'd used to record Eli's first word decades ago. I didn't want a stage, or makeup, or retakes. I wanted the truth, bare and steady, the way sound is before it becomes music. The red light blinked. I took a breath, smoothed the creases on my sleeve, and looked straight into the lens. If one night, I began quietly, you hear someone call you by the name only a loved one ever used, don't be afraid. I paused, letting the silence breathe. Maybe it's not a ghost. Maybe it's the part of your memory you've been too afraid to answer. The camera stayed still, no cuts, no background score, just my voice, cracked but alive. Behind me, the glass case holding the Zenith radio reflected a faint glow from the candles. I placed it there on purpose, not as a prop but as a witness. It had carried my fear, my faith, and finally, my freedom. It deserved to hear the end. I continued. For years I thought the static was haunting me, but it was calling me home. Every piece of noise we try to bury has a message hidden in it. And sometimes, all that message says is listen. I let that word hang. Listen. It was the simplest command in the world, yet the hardest one for the grieving. I told them about the students at Echo Atelier, how each one came carrying a silence shaped like someone they'd lost. How, week after week, they learned not to chase ghosts, but to tune in to love's leftover frequencies. I described the way Ruth's husband's laughter returned through the static of an old answering machine, how Naomi heard her sister's voice again when wind hit her window the right way. That's what we do here, I said, my voice softening. We don't bring people back. We just remind the living how to hear. I could feel the warmth of the lights on my face, the slight tremor in my hands. Not nerves, just energy, like a low hum beneath a record player's needle. Somewhere beyond the frame, I imagined Eli watching from the back of the studio, leaning against the wall with that shy smile of his. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to glance back to make sure he was there. I just knew. "If you're listening to this," I said, leaning forward slightly, "and you've ever heard a sound that made you stop, a laugh that shouldn't exist anymore, a whisper that shouldn't reach you, don't dismiss it. Record it. Write it down. Follow it. Because grief isn't the absence of sound. It's the echo trying to find its way home." A lump rose in my throat, but I kept speaking. "I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it so someone, somewhere, might stop mistaking memory for madness. Because sometimes the voice that keeps you awake isn't there to haunt you. It's there to remind you that love never unplugs." I gestured toward the glass case. "This old radio used to be the loudest thing in my life. Now it doesn't make a sound. And that's all right. Because I learned something. Silence isn't the enemy. It's just the room where truth finally resonates." The camera zoomed in slightly, just enough to catch the flicker of the candle flame, the reflection trembling across the brass inscription. He spoke once. The world heard twice. I smiled then. Not a show smile, but the kind that comes from being emptied of fear. "If you have someone you miss," I said softly, "share this story. Because somewhere out there, someone else might be hearing the voice of the person they love in a patch of static, and they're too scared to believe it's real. Let them know they're not crazy. Let them know they're not alone." I paused again, breathing in the quiet. No orchestra swelled, no cue for applause. Just the hum of the room, alive in its stillness. "All I ever wanted," I whispered, "was to be heard by the one who called me Mama. Now I am. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough." I reached forward and turned off the mic, a clean click that sounded final but not sad. The camera light dimmed. Eli, my grown boy, stepped into the frame, wrapping his arms gently around me. Neither of us spoke. The world had already heard what it needed to. Through the window, the city lights shimmered like distant frequencies bouncing across time. Somewhere, a train horn blew, low, steady, human. And for a heartbeat, I thought I could hear all the voices we'd ever lost, threading softly through the night air, reminding us that nothing truly vanishes. It just changes wavelength.